An increase in potassium and concentration increases aldosterone secretion, which stimulates the kidney's active transport mechanisms to secrete potassium ions. This control system uses negative feedback loop we have already seen. Aldosterone secretion is controlled by another more complex mechanisms. A decrease in plasma volume, a fall in blood pressure at the kidney, or an increased sympathetic nerve activity to the kidney stimulates special cells in the kidney to secrete renin. A decrease in plasma volume, a fall in blood pressure at the kidney, or an increase in sympathetic nerve activities to the kidney stimulate the cells in the kidney to secrete an enzyme called renin. Renin enters the plasma and converts renin substrate angiotensinogen 1, which in turn is converted to angiotensinin 2 by angiotensin converting enzyme in the lungs. Angiotensin 2 is a powerful vasoconstrictor, and individuals with hypertension may be prescribed angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor to lower blood pressure. Angiotensin 2 stimulates aldosterone release, which increases sodium reabsorption. The stimuli for aldosterone and ADH the stimuli for aldosterone and ADH secretions antidiuretic hormone. The stimuli for aldosterone and ADH secretion also signals that signals that stimulate thirst, a necessary ingredient to restore body fluid volume. During light exercise, little or no change occurs in plasma renin activity, or aldosterone. 87. However, when heat load is imposed during light exercise, both renin and aldosterone secretion are increased. When exercise intensity approaches 50% VO2 max, figure 5.8, renin, angiotensin, and aldosterone increase in a parallel showing linkage within this homeostatic system. Renin, angiotensin 2, aldosterone, a mineralocorticoid and regulator of Na reabsorption and potassium secretion of the kidney. Parallel increases in renin activity, angiotensin 2, and aldosterone with increasing intensities of exercise. Data are expressed as the percent change from resting values. Further, liver production of renin substrate increases to maintain the plasma concentration. In contrast, a sustained elevation of blood volume triggers the release of a trial natriuretic hormone. From muscle cells, not from an endocrine gland. A trial natriuretic hormone opposes the action of aldosterone to decrease blood volume. Cortisol, the primary glucocorticoids involved in plasma glucose regulation, secreted cortisol, the primary glucocorticoid secreted by the adrenal cortex is cortisol. By a variety of mechanisms, cortisol contributes to the maintenance of plasma glucose during long-term fasting exercise. These mechanisms promote breakdown of tissue protein by inhibiting protein synthesis to form amino acids, which are used by the liver to form new glucose, gluconeogenesis. Promote breakdown of tissue protein by inhibiting protein synthesis to form amino acids, which are then used by the liver to form new glucose, gluconeogenesis. Stimulate mobilization of free fatty acids from adipose tissue. Stimulate liver enzymes involved in metabolic pathway leading to glucosynthesis. Block the entry of glucose into tissues, forcing those tissues to use more fatty acid as fuel. A summary of cortisol's actions and its regulation is presented in Figure 5.9. Exercise, bone break, burns, stress, higher brain centers, hypothalamus. CRH. Corticotropic releasing hormone. Corticotropic releasing hormone. Anterior pituitary gland. Cortisol secretion is controlled in the same manner as thyroxine. The hypothalamus secretes a corticotropic releasing hormone, which causes the anterior pituitary gland to secrete more adrenocorticotropic hormone into the general circulation. Adrenocorticotropic hormone binds to the receptors of the adrenal cortex and increases the cortisol secretion. As the cortisol level increases, the corticotropic releasing hormone, and the adrenotropic releasing hormone are inhibited in another negative feedback system. However, the hypothalamus, like any brain center, receives neural input from other areas of the brain. The input can influence the secretion of hypothalamic releasing hormones beyond levels seen in the negative feedback system. More than 70 years ago, Hans Sly observed that a variety of stressful events such as burns, bone breaks, and heavy exercise lead to predictable increases in adrenocorticotropic adrenocorticotropic hormone, and cortisol. He called this response the general adaptation syndrome. A key point in the response was the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone and cortisol to aid in adaptation. His general adaptation syndrome had three stages: the alarm reaction involving cortisol secretion, the stage of resistance where it repairs the alarm reaction involving cortisol secretion, the stage of resistance where repairs are made, and three, the stage of exhaustion, in which repairs are not adequate and sickness or death results. The usefulness of the general adaptation syndrome in the times of stress caused by tissue damage. Cortisol stimulates the breakdown of tissue proteins to form amino acids, which can be used as the site of the tissue damage for repair. While it is clear that the muscle tissue is primary source of amino acids, the functional overload of muscle and resistance of endurance training can prevent muscle atrophy. The glucocorticoids can cause. Throughout the section, we summarize the role of hormones secreted from various endocrine glands. A closer look, 5.2 provides new addition to the list that will have profound implementations in our understanding of obesity and its disease-related consequences. Adipose tissue is an endocrine organ. Many of you know that the concentration exists between obesity epidemic in this country and the dramatic increase in the number of people with type 2 diabetes and other chronic diseases, example, coronary artery disease, cancer. However, until recently, the direct link or cause between the obesity and these diseases has remained a mystery. Fortunately, new evidence provides clues as to why too much adipose tissue has a negative impact on health. Adipose tissue has been viewed simply as a principal storage site for fat, primarily triglycerides. When caloric intake exceeds expenditure, fat storage increases. Conversely, when caloric intake cannot meet energy demands, adipose tissue releases free fatty acids into the. Conversely, when caloric intake cannot meet energy demands, adipose tissue releases free fatty acids into the circulation to provide energy for cells. Over the past 15 years, this picture of adipose tissue as a passive energy supply deposit changed markedly as it became clear that adipose tissue secretes a variety of hormones. Adipose tissue secretes a variety of hormones and other factors that have a direct effect on the metabolism and energy balance. They act through endocrine, paracrine, and autocrine mechanisms. In the mid-1900s, the hormone leptin was discovered. This hormone secreted by adipose cells, adipocytes, influenced appetite through a direct effect of feeding centers in the hypothalamus. In addition, leptin acts on the peripheral tissues to enhance insulin sensitivity, allowing insulin to act, and promotes the oxidation of free fatty acids in muscle. Adiponectin is another hormone secreted by adipocytes. This hormone also increases insulin sensitivity and fatty acid oxidation in muscle and reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease by protecting both vascular and endothelial cells and cardiac muscle. As fat mass increases, leptin secretion also increases, but strangely, food intake is not restrained. Another molecule that blocks leptin signal from reaching the hypothalamus is also produced, leading to what is known as the leptin resistance. In contrast to adipotic secretion decreases with increase in fat mass, leading to reduced sensitivity to tissues to insulin resistance, and development of type 2 diabetes, a condition in which there is plenty of insulin, but the tissues are unresponsive to it. In addition, the risk of cardiovascular disease increases. In addition, as the fatty mass increases, adipocytes produce a variety of pro-inflammatory cytokines. Example, tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin 6, and obesity is now recognized as a contributing to a state of low-grade systematic inflammation. See Chapter 6 for more information on inflammation. See Chapter 14 for connection between inflammation and chronic disease. Adipo adiponectin has the ability to suppress this systematic inflammation. But the secretion is reduced in obesity. It cannot carry out that role. These pro-inflammatory cytokines, also called adipokines in adipose tissue, can lead to both insulin resistance and atherosclerosis. What causes these changes in the adipocyte? One potential trigger is hypoxia, a relative lack of oxygen. As the mass of adipose tissue increases in obesity, some adipocytes will be further away from existing capillaries, and O2 will not be as available. It been shown that when normal adipocytes are made hypotoxic, aneurysm metabolism is increased, and lactate and hydrogen ion levels increase, and the cells respond with a decrease in adiponectin secretion and an increase in leptin and interleukin 6. Given the importance of adiponectin is another hormone secreted by adipocytes in insulin sensitivity, one might expect that exercise, which is known to improve insulin sensitivity, would increase its concentration. Interestingly, neither an acute bout of exercise nor exercise training has an effect on adiponectin concentration in the blood. In contrast, the adiponectin level increases when there is a decrease in fat mass, whether it is brought about by exercise, diet, or combined intervention. This suggests that the positive effects of exercise and weight loss on insulin sensitivity are dependent on and occur by different pathways. The same appears to be true for leptin. It is more responsive to changes in body weight than any exercise intervention. Recently, it has been shown that adipose tissue releases other factors. Example, resistin, disbatin, and also influence health and disease. Clearly, adipose tissue is not a simple passive deposit for energy storage, but directly involved in appetite, energy expenditure, and the development of inflammation-related diseases, including cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. It is clear that being physically active and maintaining a normal body weight are reasonable goals to minimize the risk of developing chronic diseases. See a closer look 5 for more information on how muscle centers counters adipose tissue tendency to promote inflammation. In summary, the adrenal cortex secretes aldosterone, mineral cortisoid, cortisoids, cortisol, glucocorticoids, and estrogen, and estrogens and androgens, sex steroids. Aldosterone regulates sodium and potassium balance. Aldosterone secretion increases with strenuous exercise, driven by the renin-angiotensin system. Cortisol responds to a variety of stressors, including exercise, to ensure that fuel, glucose, and free fatty acids is available to make amino acids available to tissue repair. The pancreas. The pancreas is both an exocrine and endocrine gland. The exocrine secretions include digestive enzymes and bicarbonate, which are secreted into ducts leading to the small intestine. The hormones are released. The hormones these the hormones are released from groups of cells and endocrine portion of the pancreas called the islets of Langerhans include insulin, glucagon. The hormones released from the groups of cells in the endocrine portion of the pancreas are called islets of Langerhans include insulin, glucagon, and somatos, somato, somatostatin.
Somatostatin.
Insulin is secreted from beta B cells of the islets of Langerhans. Islets of Langerhans. Insulin is the most important hormone during absorptive state when nutrients are entering the blood from the small intestine. Insulin stimulates the tissues to take up nutrient molecules such as glucose and amino acids and store them as glycogen, proteins, and fat. Insulin's best known role is in the facilitated fusion of glucose across cell membranes. A lack of insulin causes an accumulation of glucose in the plasma because the tissues cannot take it up. The plasma glucose concentration can become so high that reabsorption mechanisms in the kidney are overwhelmed and glucose is lost to the urine, taking large volumes of water with it. This condition is called diabetes mellitus. As mentioned earlier in this chapter, insulin secretion is influenced by a variety of factors: plasma, glucose concentration, plasma, amino acid concentration, sympathetic and parasympathetic nerve stimulation, and various hormones. The rate of secretion of insulin is dependent on the level of excitatory and inhibitory input to the beta cells of the pancreas. The beta cell of the pancreas. See Figure 5.1. Figure 5.1. Control of testosterone secretion and sperm production by the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. Control of estrogen. The blood glucose concentration is a major source of input that is part of this simple negative feedback loop. As plasma glucose concentration increases following a meal, beta cells directly monitor and increase the secretion and secrete additional insulin to enhance the tissue uptake of glucose. This increased intake lowers the plasma glucose concentration and insulin secretion is reduced. Glucagon. Glucagon created from the alpha cells in the islets of Langerhans exerts effects opposite of those insulin. Glucagon secretion increases in response to low plasma glucose concentration, which is monitored by alpha cells. Glucagon stimulates both the mobilization of glucose from the liver, stores gluconeogenesis, and free fatty acids from the adipose tissue to spare blood glucose as fat for fuel, using the adenine cyclase second messenger mechanism mentioned earlier. Last, along with cortisol, glucagon stimulates gluconeogenesis in the liver. Last, along with cortisol, glucagon stimulates gluconeogenesis in the liver. Glucagon secretion also influenced by factors other than glucose concentration, normally the sympathetic nervous system. A complete description of the role of the insulin glucagon in the maintenance of blood glucose during exercise is presented later in this chapter. Glucagon is secreted. Glucagon secretion increases in response to low blood concentration. Insulin is secreted by the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans. Glucagon is secreted by the alpha cells of islet of Langerhans in the pancreas and promotes the mobilization of glucose and free fatty acids. Somatocin. Pancreatic somatocin is secreted by the delta cells of the islets of Langerhans. Pancreatic somatocin secretion is increased during the absorptive state and modifies the activity of the gastrointestinal tract to control the rate of entry of nutrient molecules into the circulation, and it may be involved in the regulation of insulin secretion. Is increased during the absorptive state and modifies the activity of the gastrointestinal tract. Testes and ovaries. Testosterone and estrogen are the primary sex steroids secreted by the testes and ovaries, respectively. These hormones are not important in establishing and maintaining reproductive function, but they also determine the secondary sex characters as associated with masculinity and femininity. Testosterone is secreted by the interstitial cells of the testes and is controlled by the interstitial cells stimulating hormone, also known as LH. Interstitial cell stimulating hormone, also known as LH, which is produced in the anterior pituitary. LH is in turn controlled by a releasing hormone secreted by the hypothalamus. Sperm production from the seminiferous tubules from the testes requires the follicle stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary and testosterone. Figure 510 shows the testosterone secretion to be controlled by a negative feedback loop involving the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. Sperm production is controlled in part by another negative feedback loop involving the hormone inhibin. Hypothalamus. Gonadotropic releasing hormone, anterior pituitary gland, inhibin, follicle stimulating hormone, spermatogenesis, testosterone, controlled in part by another negative feedback loop involving hormone inhibin. Testosterone is both anabolic tissue building and androgenic. An androgenic promoter of masculine characteristics. Steroid because it stimulates protein synthesis and is responsible for the characteristic changes in boys at adolescents that lead to high muscle mass to fat ratio. The plasma testosterone concentration is increased 10% to 37% during prolonged submaximal workout, during exercise to maximum levels, and during endurance to strength training workouts. Some feel that these small changes are due to reduction in plasma volume or a decrease in the rate of inactivation and the removal of testosterone. However, others have concluded on the basis of a parallel increase in LH concentration. LH concentration that an increase in positive testosterone is due to an increase of rate of production. The exercise induced increase in testosterone has been viewed as a primary stimulus in muscle protein synthesis and hypertrophy, but new information suggests that testosterone alone accounts for 10% of variation in hypertrophy observed as a result of resistance training. That said, there is a considerable individual variation in hypertrophy as a result of resistance training, and part of the variation believed to be due to differences in testosterone response to exercise. Which such a developing story, are sure to hear more on this. Most most readers notably recognize testosterone or one of the synthetic analogs as one of the most abused drugs in the drive to increase muscle mass and performance. Such use is not without problem. Let's a close look. 5.3. Hypothalamus, anterior pituitary gland, focusing on hormone, LH, ovary, estrogen, development of ovum, deposition of fat to thighs and buttocks, breast development. Estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen is a group of hormones that exerts a similar physiological effects. These hormones include estradiol, estrone, and estriol, with estradiol being a primary estrogen. Estrogen stimulates breast development, female fat deposition, and other secondary sex characteristics. During the early part of menstrual cycle, called the follicular phase, LH stimulates the production of androgens in the follicle, which are subsequently converted to estrogens under the influence of follicle-stimulating hormone. Following ovulation, luteal phase of menstrual cycle begins, and both estrogens and progesterones are produced, and the corpus luteum and secretory structure occupying the space where the ovum was located. How does exercise affect these hormones, and vice versa? In one study, the plasma levels of LH and follicle-stimulating hormone, estriol, and progesterone were measured at rest and 3 different work rates during both the follicular and luteal phases of menstrual cycle. The patterns of response of the hormones during greater exercise were very similar to the 2 phases of menstrual cycle. Figure 5.12 shows only small changes in the progesterone and estriol with an increasing intensities of work. Given that the LH and follicle-stimulating hormones change little or not at all during the luteal stage, the small increases in progesterone and estriol were believed to be changes in plasma volume to increased rate of removal rather than increased rate of secretion. The effect of the menstrual cycle on exercise metabolism is not clear-cut. This is due in the part to variations in research design, methods of measurement, and intensity of exercise used in the studies. Based on the recent review, the following statements can be made. Anaerobic performances are not affected by menstrual cycle phase. The effect of menstrual cycle phase on the time trial endurance performed is mixed, and it has been suggested that the focus of future research be on ultra endurance events. Glucose mobilization is lower during luteal phase, and exercise intensity is high enough to create an energy demand for carbohydrate. However, when exercise takes place soon after a meal, or when a glucose is provided during the exercise, the impact of menstrual cycle phase is reduced or eliminated. Although animal studies show that estrogen increases lipolysis and plasma free fatty acid, human studies do not support these findings. There is an increased protein catabolism at rest during exercise in luteal stage. This appears to be due to the effect of progesterone, since estrogen has obvious effect. Consistent with this, there is a strong evidence that there is a response of glucose regulatory hormones to prolonged exercise is unaffected by menstrual cycle phase. Anabolic steroids and performance. Testosterone as both anabolic and androgenic steroid causes size changes as well as male secondary sexual characteristics respectively. Due to the combined effects, scientists developed steroids to maximize anabolic effects and minimize the androgenic effects. However, these effects can never be completely separated. These synthetic steroids were originally developed to promote tissue growth in patients who had experienced atrophy as a result of prolonged bed rest. Before long, the thought occurred to these anabolic steroids might be helpful in developing muscle mass and strength in athletes. The use of anabolic steroids is to enhance athletic performance. The use of anabolic steroids to enhance athletic performance has an interesting history. Results from the early studies were inconsistent due to various actions in dose and type of steroids used in training status of the subjects, length of study, etc. However, before long, there was a clear evidence that these steroids work. This led to the a mandatory testing of athletes in international competitions in both college and professional sports. The problem escalated when athletes started to take pure testosterone rather than the anabolic steroid. Part of the reason for the switch was to reduce the chance of a detection when drug testing was conducted, and part was related to availability of testosterone. The following information taken from the two major stands provides a good summary of what we know about the use of steroids and what should be done to curb the abuse. Androgen use causes in a concentration-dependent manner, increasing in lean body mass and muscle mass and strength in men. When androgens and resistance training combine, greater gains are released than with either intervention alone. The adverse effects in men include suppression of the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, mood, and behavioral disorders, increased risk of cardiovascular disease, liver dysfunction with oral androgens, insulin resistance, glucose intolerance, acne, and genitourinary breast development. A recent study finding of cognitive deficits in long-term anabolic steroid users support these concerns. The adverse effects in women are similar to that of men, but in addition, the androgens may have virtualizing effects such as enlargement of the clitoris, deepening of the voice, hirsutism, and changes in body build. These changes may not be reversible when androgen use is stopped. Surveys of those who use anabolic steroids provide some insights into the problem. Majority of the users were non-competitive bodybuilders and non-athletes used more than one anabolic steroid and took them in megadose amounts compared to what was recommended. However, there is evidence that the prevalence of use among teenagers has decreased. Not a day goes by that we don't read about an athlete who or a whole team being suspended because of the performance-enhancing drugs. However, it is clear that the problem is much broader than realized by the general public. The same position stands mentioned earlier emphasized the need for continued efforts to educate the athletes, coaches, parents, physicians, athletic trainers, and general public about androgen use and abuse. For more information on the list of prohibited substances, go to World Anti-Doping Agency. One last comment. A number of older adults greater than 65 years increases considerable attention being directed at the use of testosterone as a way to slow down and stop the loss of muscle mass and strength that occurs with age. This is not new and discussed in the closer look by one. Testosterone is not the only hormone being used to achieve that goal. In summary, testosterone and estrogen is established to maintain reproductive function and determine secondary sex characteristics. Chronic exercise training can decrease testosterone levels in males and estrogen levels in females. The latter adaptation has potentially negative consequences related to osteoporosis. Adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex secretes a variety of steroid hormones with rather distinct physiological functions. The hormones can be grouped into three categories: mineralocorticoids, aldosterone, involved in maintenance of sodium potassium concentration in plasma, corticoids, cortisol involved in plasma glucose regulation, sex steroids, androgens, and estrogens, which support pubescent growth, with androgens being associated with pubescent sex drive in women. The endocrine system is set up to automatically respond when homeostasis is threatened. This is especially true for plasma glucose and principal fuel for the brain. The four mechanisms presented earlier in the chapter by which the glucose concentration is protected include the following: mobilize existing glucose from the liver glycogen stores, mobilize free fatty acids from the tissue to increase the use of fat as fuel and thus spare plasma glucose, synthesize new glucose from amino acids, glycerol, oops. Block glucose entry into the cells, anti-insulin effect, forcing the cells to use fat as a fuel and thus spare plasma glucose. Table 5.2 contains a summary of the most important hormones responsible for protecting the plasma glucose concentration when glucose is being used rapidly. Example: exercise, or when the dietary intake of carbohydrate is inadequate. Example: starvation. Each of these will be discussed in detail in the next section of the chapter. However, before we leave this section, we need to introduce you to a new member of the endocrine family, muscle itself. See a closer look 5.1. Table 5.2, summary of hormonal responses that serve to mobilize fuels and preserve blood glucose during exercise. Epinephrine, gland, adrenal, response increase, muscle liver glycogenesis, mobilizes both fat and carbohydrates for fuel. Norepinephrine, medulla, glycogenesis, free fatty acid mobilization. Cortisol, adrenal cortex. Growth hormone, anterior pituitary. Glucagon, pancreas alpha cells. Insulin, pancreas beta cells. Reproductive disorders, hormonal control of substrate mobilization during exercise. The type of substrate and the rate at which it is utilized during the exercise depends on a large extent on the intensity and duration of exercise. During the strenuous exercise, there is an obligatory demand for carbohydrate oxidation that must be met. Fatty acid oxidation cannot be Shout out to my girlfriend, Pretty Kitty. Fatty acid oxidation cannot substitute. In contrast, there is a increase fatty acid oxidation cannot substitute. In contrast, there is a increase in fat oxidation during prolonged In contrast, there is an increase in fat oxidation during prolonged moderate exercise as the carbohydrate fuel are depleted. Although diet and training state of a person are important, chapters 13, 21, 23, the factors of intensity and duration of exercise is ordinarily have prominence. Because of this, our discussion of the hormonal control of substrate mobilization during exercise will be divided into two parts. The first will deal with the control of muscle glycogen utilization, and the second will control the glucose mobilization from liver and free fatty acid from adipose tissue. Muscle glycogen utilization. At the onset of most types of exercise and for the entire duration of very strenuous exercise, muscle glycogen is primary carbohydrate fuel for muscle work. The intensity of the exercise, which is inversely related to the exercise duration, determines the rate at which muscle glycogen is used as fuel. Figure 513 shows a series of lines describing the rate of glycogen breakdown for various exercise intensities expressed as a percent of VO2 max. Glycogen depletion in quadriceps muscle during bicycle exercise, increasing intensities. Glycogen depletion, moles, glycose units. The heavier the exercise, the faster glycogen is broken down. The process of glycogen breakdown, glycogen, glyco, glycogenolysis, is initiated by second messengers when active protein kinase in the muscle cell, described in Figure 5.3. Plasma epinephrine, a powerful simulator of cyclic AMP formation. Cyclic AMP formation, when bound to beta-adrenic receptors on a cell, was believed to be primarily responsible for glycogenolysis. Figure 5.14. Changes in plasma epinephrine and concentrations during exercises of different intensities and durations. Figure 5.4 also shows a family of lines, the slopes of which describe how fast plasma epinephrine changes in increasing intensities of exercise. Clearly, the data presented in Figure 5.13 and 5.14 are consistent with the view of that linkage between the changes in plasma epinephrine during exercise and increased rate of glycogen degradation. However, there is more to this story. A closer look. 5.4. Muscle as an endocrine gland. 3 of the major causes of death are cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and cancer. These diabetes are linked to the presence of low-grade chronic inflammation, as shown by elevated blood levels of the pro-inflammatory cytokines, such as tumor necrosis factor alpha. What is important to know is that during the moderate to vigorous physical activity on a regular basis, example 3 to 5 days a week, what is important to know is that doing moderate to vigorous physical activity on a regular basis, example 3 to 5 days a week, associated with positive health outcomes, including reduction of the risk in type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and certain cancers. What is the connection between exercise and reduced risk of these diseases? Until recently, little was known about the concentration, but now it appears that the muscle itself that brings about the favorable changes. Over the past 10 years, it has become clear that the muscle is an endocrine organ, that it produces a small signaling molecules called myokines, muscle cytokines. When it contracts, the number and types of these myokines continue to grow, indicating that muscle contraction plays a much larger role than simply getting us down the road. Some of the myokines act locally as an autocrine agent to stimulate glucose uptake and increase fatty acid oxidation, and as a paracrine agent to promote blood vessel growth in muscle. However, other cytokines are released into the blood, and so they act as hormones and affect a variety of tissues or organs. For example, some cytokines can increase liver production and of glucose and stimulate triglyceride breakdown in adipose tissues to provide free fatty acid for fuel. Interleukin-6 is a principal myokine produced by the muscle during exercise. Interleukin-6 can act as both a pro-inflammatory cytokine and an anti-inflammatory cytokine. That is, it can both promote inflammation and reduce it. Interleukin-6 is the first myokine to appear in the muscle and blood during exercise. Plasma interleukin-6 levels can be elevated 100-fold compared to resting conditions, though smaller changes are more typical. It is important to other pro-inflammatory cytokines associated with chronic inflammation. Example, tumor necrosis factor alpha are suppressed with exercise, suggesting that the interleukin 6 released during the exercise promotes an anti-inflammatory environment. Consistent with interleukin 6 has been shown to inhibit the production of tumor necrosis factor alpha and stimulate the production of other anti-inflammatory cytokines. In effect, the relatively large and short-lived hormonal, example epinephrine, cortisol, and myokine, example interleukin 6 responses to exercise are adaptive. That is, they help maintain homeostasis. In contrast, that the sustained chronic elevation of interleukin 6 has been seen in obesity leads to chronic disease. There is a growing body of evidence that skeletal muscle, via its cytokines, engage in crosstalk with the pancreas, liver, and adipose tissue to facilitate adaptation to exercise and enhance our overall health. Consequently, maintaining healthy amount of body fat and regular exercise program goes a long way in preventing chronic diseases. However, there's more to the story. To test the hypothesis that glycogenolysis in muscle is controlled by circulating epinephrine during exercise, investigators had subjects take propranolol, a drug that blocks both beta-1 and beta-2 adrenic receptors on the cell membrane. This adrenic cells on receptors on the cell membrane. This procedure should block glycogenolysis because cyclic AMP formation will be affected. In the control experience, subjects work for 2 minutes at an intensity of exercise that caused the muscle glycogen to be depleted to half its initial value and the muscle lactate concentration to be elevated tenfold. Surprisingly, as shown in figure 515, when the subjects took the propranolol and repeated the test on another day, there was no difference in glycogen depletion or lactate formation. Other experiments have also shown that B-androtic blocking drugs have little effect on slowing the rate of glycogen breakdown during exercise. How can this be? As mentioned in Chapter 3, enzymatic reactions in the cell are under control of both intracellular and extracellular functions. In the aforementioned example, the propanol plasma epinephrine may not be able to activate adenylate cyclase to form cyclic AMP needed to activate the protein kinase to initiate glycogen breakdown. However, when the muscle cell is stimulated to contract, calcium, which is stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, floods the cell. Some calcium ions are used to initiate the contractile events. See Chapter 8. But other ions bind to the commodulin, which in turn activates the protein kinase needed for glycogenolysis. In case the increased intracellular calcium rather than cyclic AMP is the initial event stimulating the muscle glycogen breakdown. Changes in muscle glycogen due to 2 minutes of work at 1200 kilopod per minute before and after propranolol administration. Blocking the beta adrenic receptors have no effect on glycogen breakdown. Figure 516. The breakdown of muscle glycogenolysis can be initiated by either calcium calmodulin mechanism or cyclic AMP mechanism. When drug blocks the beta receptor, glycogenolysis can still occur. Epinephrine, beta receptor cyclic AMP, phosphorylase B, phosphorylase A, glycogen, glucose 1 PO4 glycolysis, calcium, calmodulin, cysteine of the cyclopacrine. Experiments in which the increased secretion of catechyms was blocked. Catechyms. Adrenal gland. Adrenal gland is really two different glands. The adrena medulla, which secretes the catechyms, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Adrenal. The adrenal medulla, catechyms, confirm showing the secretion of catechyms was blocked during an exercise, confirmed that the propanol experiment showing that the intact system parathoadrenal system was not necessary to initiate glycogenolysis. In skeletal muscle, observations of glycogen depletion patterns support this view. Individuals who do heavy exercise with one leg will cause elevation of plasma epinephrine, which circulates to all muscle cells. The muscle glycogen, however, is depleted only from exercise legs, suggesting that intracellular factors, example calcium, are more responsible for these events. Further, in the experiments which individuals engage in intermittent exercise, interspread with the rest period, internal work, glycogen was depleted faster from the switch fibers. Plasma epinephrine concentration should be the same outside both fast and slow twitch muscle fibers, but glycogen was depleted faster at the rate from the fibers use activity. This is reasonable because at resting, muscle fibers should not be using glycogen or any other fuel at a high rate. The rate of glycogenolysis would be expected to be a parallel the rate at which ATP is used by a muscle, and this has been shown to be the case independent of E. The discussion does not mean that E cannot or does not cause glycogenolysis. There is ample evidence that show the surge of epinephrine will in fact cause this to occur. In summary, glycogen breakdown to glucose in muscle is under dual control of epinephrine, cyclic AMP, and calcium caldomin. This latter role is enhanced during exercise due to the increased calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. In this way, the delivery of fuel, glucose, parallels the activation of contraction. Blood glucose homeostasis during exercise. As mentioned in the introduction, a focal point for the hormonal systems is to maintenance of plasma glucose concentration. During times of inadequate carbohydrate intake, fasting, starvation, and accelerated glucose removal from the circulation exercise. In both cases, the body energy stores are used to meet the challenge, and the hormonal response to these two different situations, exercise and starvation, is quite similar. The plasma glucose concentration is maintained through four processes that mobilize existing glucose from the liver glycogen stored to maintain plasma glucose level, mobilize free fatty acids from adipose tissues to increase the use of fat as a fuel and spare plasma glucose, synthesize new glucose in the liver, gluconeogenesis from the amino acids lactate and cholesterol to have it available as needed, block glucose entry into the cells, and anti-insulin effect to force the cell to use fat as a fuel and thus spare plasma glucose. Their overall aim for the four processes is to provide fuel for work while maintaining plasma glucose concentration. There is major task when you consider that the liver may have only about 80 grams of glucose before the exercise begins. The rate of blood glucose oxidation approaches 1 gram per minute in heavy exercise and prolonged greater than 3 hours moderate exercise. Although the hormones will be presented separately, keep in mind that each of the four processes is controlled by more than one hormone. All four processes are involved in adaptation to exercise. Some hormones act in a permissive way or a slow-acting way. Some hormones act in a permissive way or slow-acting way, while others are fast-acting controllers of substrate mobilization. For this reason, the discussion of hormonal control of plasma glucose will be divided into two sections, one dealing with permissive, slow-acting hormones, and the other dealing with fast-acting hormones. Permissive slow-acting hormones. Thyroxine, cortisol, and growth hormone are all involved in the regulation of carbohydrate, fat, and protein metabolism. Thyroxine and growth hormone. These hormones are discussed in the secretion because they either facilitate the actions of other hormones or respond to the stimuli in a slow manner. Remember that to act in a permissive manner, the hormone concentration doesn't have to change. However, as you will see, in certain stressful situations, permissive hormones can achieve such elevated plasma concentration as they act directly to influence the carbohydrate and fat metabolism rather than to simply facilitate the actions of other hormones. Thyroid hormones. The discussion of substrate mobilization during exercise must include the thyroid hormones T3 and T4 with free concentration do not change when dramatically resting to exercising. As mentioned earlier, T3 T4 are important in establishing our overall metabolic rate and allowing other hormones to exert their full effect. Permissive hormones. They accomplish this later function by influencing either the number of receptors in the surface of the cell for other hormones to attack with, or the affinity of the receptor of the hormone. For example, without T3, epinephrine has little effect on the mobilization of free fatty acids from the adipose tissue. During exercise, there is an increase in free T3 due to changes in the binding of the characteristics of the transfer protein. T3 and T4 are removed from the plasma by tissues during exercise at a greater rate than rest. In turn, thyroid hormone secretion from the anterior pituitary is increased to stimulate the secretion of T3 and T4 thyroid gland to maintain the plasma level. The low levels of T3 and T4 hypothyroxine state would indicate the ability of the other hormones and mobilize fuel for exercise. Cortisol. The primary glucocorticoid in humans is cortisol. As figure 517 shows cortisol. The role of cortisol in the maintenance of plasma glucose. Cortisol, protein amino acids, gluconeogenesis in the liver, amino acids and cholesterol, glucose, blood fatty acids, tissue fatty acid, box entry, glucose. There stimulates free fatty acid mobilization from out of tissue, mobilizes tissue protein to yield amino acids, glucosynthesis in the liver, gluconeogenesis, decreases the rate of glucose utilization by cells. There are problems, however, when attempting to describe cortisol response to exercise, given the general adaptation syndrome by style and other events of exercise can influence the cortisol response. Imagine how a native subject might view the treadmill test on the first exposure. The wires, nose clip, mouthpiece, and blood sampling could all influence the level of arousal of the subject and result in cortisol response that is not related to the need of the mobilized additional substrate. As exercise intensity increases, one expect the cortisol secretion to increase. This is true, but only with certain limits. For example, Bonin showed that the urinary excretion of cortisol was not changed by exercise at 76% VO2 max for 10 minutes, but was increased by twofold when the duration was extended to 30 minutes. Davies and Few expanded our understanding of cortisol response to exercise when they studied the subjects who completed several one-hour exercise bouts. Each test was a set of constant intensity between 40% and 80% VO2 max. At 40% VO2 max resulted in a decrease in plasma cortisol over time, while the response was considerably elevated for the exercise at 80% VO2 max. Figure 5.8 shows the plasma cortisol concentration measured at 60 minutes into each of the exercise tests plotted against percent VO2 max. Percent change from resting values in the plasma cortisol concentration with increasing exercise intensity. When the exercise intensity exceeded 60% VO2 max, the cortisol concentration increased. Below that, the cortisol concentration decreased. What caused these changes? Using radioactive cortisol as a tracer, the researchers found that during light exercise, cortisol was removed faster than the adrenal cortex secreted it, and during intense exercise, the increase in plasma cortisol was due to the higher rate of secretion that could be more matched the rate of removal, which had doubled. What is interesting is that for the low intensity, long duration exercise, where the effects of cortisol would go a long way in maintaining plasma glucose concentration, the concentration of cortisol does not change very much. Even if it did, the effects on the metabolism would not immediately be noticeable. The direct effect of cortisol mediated through the stimulation of DNA and the resulting mRNA formation, which leads to protein synthesis and a slower process is, in essence, cortisol is like dioxin, exerts a permissive effect on the substrate mobilization during the exercise, allowing other fast-acting hormones such as epinephrine and glucagon to deal with glucose and free fatty acid mobilization. Support for this was provided in a study in which the drug was used to lower plasma cortisol before, during submaximal exercise. The overall metabolic response was not affected compared to a normal cortisol condition. Given the athletic competitions, triathlon, ultra marathon, most team sports can result in tissue damage. The reason for changes in plasma cortisol concentration might not be to mobilization of fuel for exercising muscles. In situations, cortisol's role with dealing with tissue repair might come to the forefront. Growth hormone. Growth hormone plays a major role in synthesis of tissue protein, acts either directly or through an enhanced secretion of insulin insulin growth-like factors from the liver. However, growth hormone also influences fat and carbohydrate metabolism. Figure 5.9 shows that growth hormone supports the action of cortisol. Growth hormone increases amino acid and glycerol, glucose, gluconeogenesis in the liver, triglycerides to fat, cholesterol, blocks entry of fat tissues fatty oxidations. Decreases glucose uptake in tissue, increases fatty acid mobilization, enhances gluconeogenesis in the liver. The net effect is to preserve the plasma glucose concentration. Describing the plasma growth hormone response to exercise is as difficult as describing cortisol response to exercise, because glucose growth hormone can be altered by a variety of physical and chemical and psychological stress. Given that the earlier comments about cortisol should be kept in mind. Figure 520A shows plasma growth hormone to increase with increasing intensities of exercise. Percent change from resting values in the plasma growth hormone concentration with increasing exercise intensity. Growth hormone to increase with increasing intensities of exercise, achieving at maximal work values of 25 times those at rest. Figure 520B shows the plasma growth hormone concentration to increase over time during 60 minutes at 60% VO2 max. Percent change from resting values in the plasma growth hormone concentration during exercise at 60% VO2 max for runners and non-runners. What is interesting compared to other hormonal responses is that trained runners had a higher response compared to a group of non-runners. See fast-acting hormones. By 60 minutes, values of both groups were about 5 to 6 times those measured at rest. It must be added that the higher the growth hormone response at the same row growth shown by trained individuals has not been universally observed. Some reports lower responses following training. In conclusion, growth hormone, primarily concerned with protein synthesis, can achieve plasma concentrations during exercise that can exert a direct but slow-acting effect on carbohydrate and fat metabolism. In summary, the hormones thyroxine and cortisol and growth hormone act in permissive manner to support the actions of other hormones during exercise. Growth hormone and cortisol also provide a slow-acting effect on carbohydrate fat metabolism during exercise.